Super. So this is similarly easy to use. We have essentially 4 groupings of chart types, and within each of them, a large number of charts which you can directly interact with. So each of them has filters built in. And I'll go ahead and dive in. Some of these charts you can see quite clearly in the fantastic PDF reports that are produced by the SMAP team after these multi-tier framework surveys are conducted. But what, of course, they can't do in a PDF format is allow a user to interact with those charts. So taking some kind of the very simple, straightforward charts, not only can you see very clearly, okay, this is the electricity access situation in Kenya nationally. You can very quickly see breakdowns at kind of an urban or a rural level. You can very quickly say, oh, well, only show me people actually that are cooking with charcoal, and what does that look like? Or even, you know, what kind of stove are they using, and what does that mean for their electricity access, the correlation between those elements. And so there's essentially thousands of potential permutations possible across these charts. And this one is a pretty straightforward one, but I'm looking forward to showing you some of the ones that are a little bit different, that often don't even make it into the reports, and that say a lot about the status quo in a particular market. And hopefully we'll give practitioners ideas as to how to kind of improve the way in which they target households, and better understand the challenges that those households are facing. So what I'm going to do now is I'm just going to bring you through a handful of these charts, as I did with the geospatial module on those layers, and then we can talk a little bit about other potential uses. So for the cooking fuel ones, this is a pretty grim situation. Of course, very few people cooking with LPG in Kenya, or other modern forms of fuel. And if you switch to the rural view, it's even worse still. When you look at the primary source of household lighting, there's stark differences based on where households are located, which you can change here. There's a really interesting differences when you look at what people are cooking with, because again, essentially the inverse of what we were saying before. So you're saying, oh, people that are cooking with LPG are almost 90% of them are connected to the electricity grid. People that are cooking with firewood, extremely small percentage of them are connected to the grid. And not just that, almost 50% of them don't have any access to electricity at all. So these are clearly the target group for remaining electrification efforts. We do a lot on stopgap households. Some of it is here and some of it is in further breakdowns. So primary sources of backup lighting. This is a really interesting one that people don't necessarily pay much attention to. The reality being that a lot of people, when they get connected to the grid because of unreliability of the grid, still end up using lots of other sources of stopgap solutions. And you can see how that differs actually between, you know, people that have tier 5 access or people that have, you know, say tier 1 access via solar system. The difference between kerosene use and candle use is pretty fascinating. It has greenhouse gas implications, but also expenditure implications for households. Let's move forward and look at, say, some more cooking fuel details. We've made some very cool charts, we think, that are kind of heat maps. And this I think can really help people understand the norms in under different conditions. So for this one you're looking at now is primary cooking fuel type versus primary stove type. And you can see, like, at a national level, the most common combination is still firewood with a 3-stone open fire. If you switch to urban, there's a big shift, and you see a lot more kind of charcoal and LPG use with manufactured stoves. And you can even, you know, pick what, based on primary source of electricity, how that changes. Let's zip forward to our module 2, which is a consumption and economics module. So this is a lot of this is about expenditures and about usage. And one of the more interesting ones that I think is really worth pulling up is again looking at people's use of stopgap sources, namely kerosene and candles. And one thing you can see very clearly looking at this chart, for example, we're looking at globally now the use of kerosene candles, but if you flip and say, hey, let's just look at candles. Candles are in Kenya are broadly being used as a backup source for people with electricity connections that are typically unreliable. If you switch to hurricane lamps, so a type of kerosene lamp, you can see people are using these on essentially a regular basis as their primary source of lighting. And we can show that, you know, we can show information on monthly expenditures, weekly expenditures, sorry, here on lamps, and how that changes depending on essentially your electricity tier level. obviously all these other breakdowns that I've mentioned before, which I think are really, really quite powerful and will help those companies that are better trying to understand potential clients, understand how much they're spending on these stopgap sources. Very often, like I said, with average household size and the impact figures that people are calculating, there's a tendency to use averages when in fact you really need to be able to see the spread, which we're showing to you here, right? Some people may be spending a lot, but a lot of people are spending very little, and the average doesn't actually mean that much when you're targeting clients. We simply have expenditures on cooking related elements, so on fuel for stoves and how that breaks down. So if you're wanting to understand like how much people are spending on LPG versus how much they're spending on say charcoal, a really interesting ongoing question of the affordability of LPG vis-a-vis charcoal and the potential to transition those types of users over. And then things on like willingness to pay for say a full fuel wood cook stove in this case. So we're showing here the people that don't know whether they can afford it or know they can afford it, and the reasons why they wouldn't purchase a stove, and how that changes kind of nationally and based on what kind of electricity access they have too. And then we have a lot of charts here on expenditures. So as Dana mentioned, it's not strictly related to energy, but there are obviously going to be some interesting relationships between these things. So you can see kind of how much people are spending on transportation per month and how that varies between different energy situations. Expenditures on, and I like this one here. This is expected monthly expenditure on electricity. So this is specifically for households that don't have access to the KPLC grid currently. Their own view about how much they could be spending or they would spend if they were to get an electricity connection. And just looking right here, I don't know if people know the exchange rate now, but we're talking like the vast majority of people that answered this question think that they would spend on the order of $3 to $5 per month on electricity. And that's a factor that's going to be really interesting and relevant to KPLC when they're doing their own thinking about the economics of grid extension and whether or not there may be other better solutions for providing access to these clients. So really a lot to work with here.